I want to first acknowledge that we're gathering on the Lenni Lenape country, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and it's very important for me to do that as a Palestinian and the daughter of a dispossessed Palestinian, and to understand that I am here as a guest. In this panel, we are going to be discussing anti-colonial resistance and liberation movements as a global struggle. And I'm delighted to be among these absolute intellectual luminaries, artists, journalists, truth tellers. Their biographies are in the program, but I'll just give a quick rundown. We are joined by Zukiswa Wana by Zoom. I hope she's on there. Can anyone see her? She'll be joining us shortly. Who's a multi-award-winning South African novelist, editor, curator based in Kenya, a prolific journalist, essayist, short story writer. We are joined by Marc Lamont Hill, who is one of the leading intellectuals in this country, the host of Bet News, the Coffee and Books podcast, the Steve Charles Professor of Media, Cities and Solutions at Temple University, and the author of multiple books. Lorna Munro, who is a Wiradjuri and Gamalori woman, multidisciplinary artist, regular radio and podcast host, and absolutely lit the place up last night with a terrific, amazing, powerful spoken word poetry. We're joined by David Palumbo-Liu, who is the Louise Howlett Nixon Professor and Professor of Comparative Literature at Stanford University, a prolific writer across mediums. His latest book is Speaking Out of Place, Getting Our Political Voices Back. It's an amazing book. And he's also the member of the organizing committee of the US campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel, and one of our also staunchest longtime solidarity activists with Palestine. And so I want to just say that how privileged I am to be here. My name is Randa Abdel-Fattah. I'm Palestinian from Australia, from settler Australia, and it's a real privilege and honour to be in discussion with you all today. So I'm going to start with you. I wanted to talk to you about, you spoke on a panel in May 2023 entitled Surviving Colonialism, and you drew attention to the parallels of apartheid and racial segregation between South Africa and Palestine. You were invited to present at PALFest in Palestine earlier this year. You wrote such a moving account of your trip in a blog post for Jerusalem Story. I encourage you all to look that up. And I want to ask you about solidarity, and in particular, witnessing, active witnessing, as Maitha Al-Hassan puts it. She talks about witness as withness, empathy that takes action. Did your trip give you any new thoughts about how we can all engage in witness and withness in our efforts to be there for each other in solidarity?
It absolutely did. When I wrote the section that you read on Jerusalem Story, I wrote it in the moment. So it wasn't after I'd done the whole trip. I have to tell you, when I did the rest of the trip and I finished it, I was traumatized. When I finished writing everything else, I remember being in a hotel room in Berlin and unable to get out of bed, because the day I finished it, I couldn't get out of bed. I was just so emotionally high-strung and unable to do anything, because I thought to myself, I think South Africa got a bad deal with the Congress of a Democratic South Africa negotiations. And when I read the Oslo Accord, I thought that was worse than CODESA. But to be able to engage with Palestine and finding out that the Oslo Accord is, what is actually what Palestinians are dealing with is even worse than what the Oslo Accord affords them, because essentially the Oslo Accord was what the Bantustans in South Africa got during apartheid. That to me was something I couldn't really relate. And it was when you think something is bad, having 25-year-olds questioning my being and my existence in Palestine, that to me was the worst. I don't understand how Palestinians every day are able to go through that. And yeah, it's a lot. I'm still trying to understand it.
Thank you so much. David, in your book, Speaking Out of Place, Getting Our Political Voices Back, you argue that making the connection between neoliberalism, extractive capitalism, and destroying the planet means that we can't settle for a justice that's just arrived by distributing things in a more even way. That the very relationship between people and resources has to be rethought from the bottom up, and we have to imagine an entirely new way of looking at the planet and our relationship with it and to ourselves, imagining and inventing a new place of a sense of the place from which we speak. It's just such a profoundly moving book, and I wanted you to share with us what you mean by that reimagination of and the sense of a place from which we speak.
Thank you for the credit, but my credit really goes to other people. In other words, we all stand on the shoulders of other people. So I wanted to, in response to the question, talk about people who've really done a lot of amazing work. But first of all, I think it's important for us to remember where the term Global South comes from. It comes from the G77, which convened in Algiers in 1967, and it had an explicit anti-apartheid platform. And it was explicitly a constellation of nation states who were arguing for self-determination and political and economic independence. So there's an automatic built-in common solidarity with an anti-colonial, anti-settler colonial project. I want to cite 3 books that I think are really important, and one is Olivia Harrison's work on the figure of the Palestinian in Europe. And she talks about a triangulation between Arab labor, left labor, and Palestinians. And there were these really interesting cultural collaborations. For example, Jean-Luc Godard and Darwish collaborated on film together. So there's kind of labor Marxist solidarity there. Manija Morandian, a remarkable book on Iranian student revolutionaries in the United States. And when they took part in the Third World Revolution demonstrations, they always insisted on mentioning Palestinians. And finally, there's a great book coming out by Marc and Monberg called 21 Voices from South Africa and Israel, Why the Palestinian Struggle Matters. So those are 3 reference points. The other, in terms of the environment, Edward Said has a remarkable passage in Culture and Imperialism when he talks about the importance of looking at the connection between the Earth's environment and the Palestinian cause. Shireen Sekeli has a great article in Jabaliya called Palestine as Paradigm, which he looks out at the devastating landscape of California and compares it to what's going on in terms of climate apartheid in Palestine. Nora Erekat, Designing the Future in Palestine, has a wonderful essay talking about seeds when you think about Vandana Shiva's work in India and the way that the land and the crops have been commandeered by capitalists. And the resonance between that and what's going on in Palestine is very powerful. And finally, Susan Abahawa's Before the Last River is another great essay that talks about the environment in Palestine. And finally, and this is somebody that I didn't know, you knew Mike as well, Mike Lynch White. So Mike Lynch White was one of the co-founders of Scientist Rebellion. And I interviewed his other co-founder, Tim Coolidge, the other day, and we tried to get Mike on the phone. It was very hard. He's in prison. And he's serving the longest sentence ever meted out in the UK for a nonviolent protest because he took part in an action with Palestine Action. So here's a climate scientist who's forming solidarity with Palestinians. And they basically did a demonstration against these drone manufacturers in the UK. They're supplying Israel. So in all those senses, we see this very firm connection between earth, resources, land, not only as a political platform, but also as what Sylvia Federici calls a site of reproduction. By reproduction, she means not just human reproduction, but a reproduction of social worlds. And what we're trying to see here in terms of solidarity in the Global South is a better social world for everybody, and especially those that are suffering the worst aspects of these deliberate acts of de-development, as it were.
Thank you, David. Lorna, you are a sovereign Wiradjuri and Gamilaraay woman, living, thriving, resisting, partying, creating, mothering in the only major Commonwealth country in the world that does not have a treaty with its First Nations people. And you write on stolen land, but like the Palestinian Nakba, the theft wasn't a single act or crime, but an enduring structure. You write at the scene of that crime as those crimes are being carried out, with traditional lands of First Nations people constantly under a threat from being destroyed in the interests of capitalism, mining companies, and the state. How does that myth of terra nullius continue to manifest in your Redfern community through process of gentrification, and how do you fight against it? I know that's something that you've written a lot about and work actively against, and I think that we can sit on these panels and talk. The tendency or the risk is that we can talk very polemical, but this is the reason I'm so happy with these panelists today, is because the work is grassroots, and that's really what I want to talk about rather than the theory. And I know that I'm going to get that from all of you because you're committed to the grassroots and community, and so that's what I wanted you to share with us today. Take us to Redfern.
Well, it's a really interesting time for Redfern at the moment. Redfern and Waterloo are two of the smallest suburbs in the middle of the city. Redfern and Waterloo are historically Black communities. We've got Aboriginal families that have never left, that have been there forever and have maintained that connection in an urban landscape, with this transient Black population as well as, the established community. It's a bit different now. I think the whole Australian psyche, everything goes back to terra nullius. We see it in all different ways. Like when you think about Australia, you're more likely to think about Crocodile Dundee, a white man holding a knife, instead of the Aboriginal kid that taught him how to skin a crocodile or whatever, is his claim to fame. I think there's heaps of different variations of that disappearing of Aboriginal people, because terra nullius means no man's land. Terra nullius was the thing that the British used to say back to their bosses, there's no one here, we can go ahead. America has closed the gates. It's a free-for-all down here in this island. And I really liken what it's been like for the last 250 years surviving colonialism as Lord of the Flies 250 years later. And we've been a witness to that, all that savagery. The interesting thing about Redfern is it's captivated the Australian imagination to the point now where we've got TV series which is set in Redfern. The idea around that series originally was that they would work with people from the community and they would have actors. I actually featured in many episodes. That's a story for another day. But they brought in writers from outside of the community, and we was told, that there would be another series and we'd have workshops with community to be able to tell our stories and things like that. That never really happened, and I was kind of told, well, Redfern's just the backdrop for everyone else's story. And I think that that's really interesting because it's created this fantasy of what Redfern is, which totally dehumanizes the actual lived experience of surviving colonization for so long and being able to build an urban Black community where we've had the country's first walk-in medical services inspired by Black Panthers. We've got legal services, housing co-ops, Aboriginal early education centres, and I really am the product of that. So it's been one of the most heartbreaking things to experience, all of these great things that have influenced me and really, become my bread and butter, which is Black politics. Like I always say, my mum dished up black politics at our table like breakfast, lunch and dinner, and we ate that happily. And the experience that I have, it wasn't until I grew up that I started to realize that it was a very unique experience. And my work now today is platforming, truth-telling, cutting through all of this myth-building fantasy sort of idea of Aboriginal life in Redfern, urban Sydney, and what that means to have that survival now being threatened by gentrification. So we often talk about colonisation in waves, and a lot of my work is talking about decolonisation has to be in waves as well.
Thank you, Lorna. There isn't probably a single Palestinian here today who doesn't know someone who has decolonial in their Instagram bio but has never spoken out about Palestine. So we're talking, of course, about the PEPs, the Progressives Accept Palestine, although I take exception to that because I don't think you can be progressive if you are not supporting Palestine. So, Marc, in a time of social media, there's no excuse. Israel's war crimes are happening and being shown in real time. Nobody can, it's no longer possible that you can sort of whip out those rhetorical shields or I don't know enough or it's complex or there are two sides. It's there in front of you and you cannot deny the evidence. What I'm interested in is the chilling effect on allies that comes with proclaiming and showing solidarity for Palestine. We saw it yesterday with Roger Waters and Gary Young, who, as allies, were not allowed to attend the festival physically, and you paid the price with your job at CNN.
I'm sorry, I just found this out. I'm finding this out.
Yeah, so Roger was on Zoom from, I think, the airport, and Gary Young's visa was denied to him at the airport in the UK, despite the fact he has book launches, his wife is American, and his children. And I don't know, I'm coming here from Australia. I don't know if you've spoken about the CNN thing a million times, but...
What happened?
So I'm sorry if this is rehashing things that you all know, but I think that it's important to also honour the fact that everyone who stands up for Palestine pays sacrifices for that. And the question of how that chilling effect does affect people who would otherwise stand up. And you wrote a book about this, the Palestine exception, limits to progressive politics. So talk to us about that, please, and whether you think the chilling effect is actually working.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I like the way you framed the progressive except for Palestine thing. I agree, you can't be progressive except for, you can't, it's like I'm anti-racist except for black people. You can't, doesn't work that way. Being progressive except for Palestine is a fundamental contradiction that cancels the identity itself. It's not a quirk, it's a thing that you can't be. But self-identified progressives have, and to some extent, been able to largely ignore what's happening in Palestine, particularly in the United States, and particularly US media, because of how US media has covered it. It's been shrouded in all the language you just described. It's complicated, it's messy, there's two sides, all those people have been warring forever, it's a religious, all of these things that are ahistorical, untrue, dishonest, etc., orientalistic, all these things. But in the last few decades, and certainly the last 10 years, I would say there's been a resurgence in, not in South, there's been a nonstop movement of solidarity, both from people in the United States and more broadly in the West and also in the global South with Palestine. That's never stopped. But we saw an interesting resurgence post-Ferguson, post-2014. We started to see that conversation become more vocalized. We began to see more people paying attention to it. And part of it was because a lot of the activism that we saw coming out on the ground, the kind of grassroots radical Black traditions that people are emerging out of, that people were sort of engaging, were very different than the ones that had been engaged prior. So now they're not just talking about traditional church-centered mainline civil rights movements, but they're also talking about the Panthers. They're talking about SNCC. They're invoking movements and traditions that were always in conversation with the global South. After the 1967 war, for example, SNCC published a newsletter that summer, written by Ethel Minor, a Black woman, and they framed this as a form of neocolonialism, right? The piece that Malcolm X wrote in the Egyptian Gazette in September of '64 about the role of Israel in the global community was one that was part of our Black radical tradition of Black critique that invoked the language of colonialism. So when you're on the street and people are screaming Assada's name, or they're talking about Angela, or they're talking about SNCC, or they're talking about Malcolm, now suddenly they're in conversation with different traditions. And I think it's important to raise that, but it's also important to talk about, and I'm going to answer the last part of your question real quick. I think the other part of this, though, is that it's not just about North-South, it's about South-South. And a lot of times we sort of celebrate the solidarities with the global North, but not with the global South. So the field work, the research that I do in Jerusalem, that I did in Jerusalem, part of it was with political prisoners, and many of them, particularly from different political parties, they would talk about the books they were reading. They were reading Fanon, and they were thinking about, they're thinking about Algeria. They're also thinking about South Africa. They're thinking about, so many of the solidarities that have been most powerful have nothing to do with us here in the States, but are in the global South, and they were sort of the model for it. But here, there's a chilling effect of what it means to say, I stand in solidarity with Palestinians. I stand for Palestinian, not just human rights, which can be also a kind of sanitizing language, but also self-determination, freedom. To frame it not just as a freedom struggle, but an anti-racist struggle, to frame it as a struggle against settler colonialism. To use this language is to, of course, carry the label of anti-Semite. It's to carry the language of racist. It's to carry the language, all of these things, which are often used to distract from the actual injustice that's happening in the region. And so with me, that's sort of what happened. I was flying back from I was in Khan al-Ahmar the night before. I flew, landed, went to the UN, wrote the speech, and I never write speeches, but I was like, I'm gonna write this one just so I don't cause any trouble. And the next thing I knew, I gave this speech that I invoked, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to point out all of these contradictions between, again, progressive values and what's happening in Palestine. And at the end, when I said free Palestine from the river to the sea, that became a pretext for ignoring the other, I don't know how many thousand words of the speech, the other 28 minutes of the speech, and to focus on these 6 words, which were grossly taken out of context, misrepresented, and framed as if I were calling for genocide, when in fact I was calling for freedom for everybody. I was calling for a secular democratic state. But that was used. I didn't get fired from Temple. I got fired from CNN the next day. They said this contradicts with our values, which it does. They wasn't lying, But Temple also wanted to fire me. I don't want y'all to pretend like Temple was like cool about it. The university also applies pressure for people who support Palestinian rights. All these people, all these right wingers who love to talk about cancel culture, how awful it is. That's also except for Palestine. Yeah. I don't want to take up any more time, but there's a lot of there are penalties that you pay for having certain values, for having certain positions. The last thing I'll say is when I was at CNN, I also advocated the Green Party candidate that year and not the Democratic Party candidate. I went on TV for 6 months. So there's a way that corporate media won't allow you to have radical politics of any sort. It's not particular to Palestine, but it includes Palestine, and we don't want to pretend that it's random. There are very particular positions you can't take in mainstream corporate media or in mainstream corporate universities without some penalty.
Yeah. Thank you. Zuka, so I speak at a lot of schools. I go into schools and I speak about my books. And the other day I was at a school and I was speaking to students who are about 15, and I was talking about Palestine and apartheid, and somebody put up their hand and said, "What's that?" And I realized that, if you even look at the way that festivals are structured, I honestly think that there should always be a young person at a panel table, because we tend to talk about these things and reference points and history, and it's so important that we understand that we are speaking from a certain socialization and historical context and lived memory and experience. I think all of you please to comment on is how we have a responsibility to create spaces and opportunities for young people to refuse to settle. I loved that word that there was a line in your book, David, about how young people are sort of directed towards neoliberal choices that tame their politics, that de-radicalize, that depoliticize them, that take them away from spaces of collective democracy to thinking that it's all about their individual efforts. And inevitably that leads to helplessness because no one person can change the system. But it's on us to help young people have opportunities to build their political education in a way that's also accessible, not expensive, and you need to spend a lot of money to get to the city, to go to a panel, all these little questions that we sometimes forget about. So Kiswa, if you could kick off that conversation, and I'm not calling us all old here or anything, but really just to bring into this conversation, not to also trivialize the idea of the next generation. I don't like to do that, but to think seriously about making this something that really is grassroots for all generations.
Which we are really. We are old people. Particularly me speaking to you from Africa, which is the youngest continent really. But I had a conversation with my son who is 18 years old, and he said to me, because he read Id Tamimi's book, which I think some of you have read, on just surviving and thriving and being imprisoned by the Israeli state. And he said to me, after he finished reading it, I think it really touched him, and it's a conversation that we've had as he has grown up. And he said to me, Mama, I said, yes. And he said, how old is she? I said, she's 22. And he said to me, yeah, I'm thinking about South African and Palestinian solidarities. And I started laughing, and I said, you're such a cis heterosexual male, because why do you assume that she would be interested in you, But but it's I was having the same conversation with my nieces today, because I took my nieces for brunch earlier, and I was telling them how I'm really still trying to process Palestine, and I showed them I think I was in Hebron, and one of the most disturbing photographs that I took and I showed them, say to me, was there's IDF soldiers, and they had guns to young children who were no more than 10 years old. And the reason why they had guns to them was because they had put there was a barrier, or and these children couldn't go through that, and they were coming from school, and their home was 200 meters away from this place, but they had to walk 1.2 kilometers to go past this place so that they could get to their house. And I thought to myself, how does a child grow up in this situation and then not then become radical? How does a child grow up in such a situation and just be normal? And a 5-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 15-year-old should not be militant, should not be thinking about, who is the enemy, and even in the idea of thinking who the enemy is, because I also saw the other children, the Israeli children, the settler children, because this is Hebron, so you've got 400 settlers being protected by 1,500 IDF, and the IDF guys. So you had these children who like 5, 6, 4, 3, 7, 9, but they have already been told that these other people are the enemies. So how do we unlearn that type of miseducation? And then I was talking to Molly Crabapple, who is she's an artist, and she is American, and she is her mom is Jewish, but she is very anti-Zionism. And in fact, she has actually done the cover for a work that I'm doing right now on Palestine. And as we were walking from the mosque in Hebron, the Ibrahimi mosque, I saw two young people, both IDF, and one of them, I turned to her and I said, "That young woman is South African." And she said to me, "How do you know she's South African?" And I said, "I know she's South African because she was singing the apartheid anthem." And that was the first time I realized that a conversation that I heard, but I actually didn't believe was happening, because we had talked to uh, one of the international organizations, and they had told us that the biggest settlers right now in Israel are Americans, they're Europeans, and they're South Africans. A lot of them Afrikaners who are converting to Judaism, perhaps because they have apartheid nostalgia.
Wow, thank you. David, can I throw that to you, about, especially in the context of your book and about the work that we need to do with young people, with and for?
Right. I want to go back to something that Marc said. You know, when you think about, well, I was in college during the Vietnam War, and the same language that Marc was evoking: anti-imperialist, anti-racist, anti-colonial. And don't forget, the Vietnamese people won. You know,
Yeah.
we can't. And people say, you know, what about today? And I think you have the rise of, not just in Israel, but India certainly. You know, think of the state of Kashmir. It's an ongoing settler colonial project. This violent assassination of Sikhs in Canada that go unpunished. So we have the rise of ethno-nationalism. We have, in terms of the earth, eco-fascism. So one thing that Gary Young said last night, which I thought was really powerful, I never knew he started off as a translator. And I think the act of translation is something so important to us all today, to be able to translate across specific vocabularies on the basis, again, of something that Marc mentioned, which I think is super important: common values, right? We can not quite understand the language coming out of a different space, a different political struggle, but what we have in common is a common set of values for liberation and autonomy. And I think fundamental to that is to see through the liberal, neoliberal bullshit smokescreen. The words that make us want to feel like things aren't so bad. Another book I would really recommend is Sarah Ahmed's The Feminist Killjoy Handbook, which has an amazing discussion about happiness, and how happiness is a weapon placed on people. You don't say this, you're going to ruin the table, you know, you're going to ruin the dinner table conversation if you speak up about patriarchy. So I think we all have to be we don't have to set aside happiness, we have to understand the ways in which happiness actually means things, and it can be an instrument. So I would say that in terms of education, and you know, I understand the need. I'm a materialist. We need jobs. You need to have a good life. But don't let your political and personal imagination be ruled by a lexicon that you have nothing to do in terms of shaping, right? Just don't take these words. Again, you know, Sarah quotes Simone de Beauvoir. The introduction to the second sex is amazing, because she says happiness is a place where people get placed. You know, you get put there. And she says, we reject that because we are existential ethicists.
we believe we are put on the world not to accept the world that we inherit as an existence, but to transform the conditions of existence, not just for ourselves, but for everybody else who's suffering under the heels of oppression. So it sounds like a big ticket item, but I encourage all of you to start loosening the gears of your imagination with the help of other people. You know that I'm quoting all these other people. That's how I work. We work in conjunction with other people, and be receptive to different ideas, even if they don't appear to ring bells immediately with the immediate cases that you're working on. But imagine what might be the conjunctions between different struggles and your own intentions.
Yeah. Lorna, can you talk to us about the incredible work you do with young people, especially through your creative work and creative practice?
Sorry, excuse me. Let me try to think where to start. I was very much mentored by the surviving members of the Black Power movement who set up all of those things that I listed before. A lot of them, my mum and my dad were a part of that, which is why I had access to all of this knowledge. I had access, privy to conversations and strategic conversations, national conversations around mobilizing our people. Since I was a teenager, I was actually the only young person in the room for a very long time with all these older fellas. So that then becomes a cultural obligation to then get as many other young people in the room so that you're not the only one that sits with to then reiterate and transmute. I think I've found myself in a really interesting position being a poet, being someone who enjoys telling stories but has figured out a way to be able to impact the way that other people feel. You know, I don't, Maya Angelou, you know, you might walk into a room, say a few things. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but you know, people are never gonna forget the way that you make them feel. And if you can make them feel something, you automatically drew a line from my heart straight to yours. So these are all tools. I was very much enthralled by the theatrics of the politics of the generations before. You know, my uncles and stuff, there was one Aboriginal artist, I'm forgetting his name, I think his name was Yirawalla, and he had his art stolen by a major gallery. And my uncles who were working at the Aboriginal Legal Service, they were actually like stepping in for lawyers for cases representing Aboriginal people because Aboriginal people are still overrepresented in the jails. They then went and stole this painting just so that it would be in the news, so that attention was brought to the case. And then they represented him. So a lot of the work that I've been doing is like uncovering these stories, finding the photos, talking to people, trying to get our young people thinking about what their voice is. How do we help them tell their stories? Because with each young person that we can get trained up behind the mic and confident and feeling themselves and, you know, enjoying it, it then becomes this kind of thing of like, well, what stories are you going to tell? Of course, our stories, especially in my community, the most important stuff that I'm working on at the moment is a family histories project, is actually documenting the community before it continues to change too much under the threat of gentrification. And when these young people start actually researching their own family trees and telling their family stories, they're actually undoing the myth of terra nullius. And terra nullius is the legal mechanism that the British used to legally invade the land that is now known as Australia. Even by their own laws, they did the wrong thing. So that's why terra nullius is such an interesting concept, and why training and getting our young people versed in these ways of being able to hold on to their family stories, that they are undoing terra nullius with each family story.
Thank you, Lorna. Marc, I'll just ask you to comment and then we'll open for questions about the work you do with young people.
Yeah, most of the, it's two types of work. You know, one type of work that I do is here in the States with political education. You know, we're at a moment in history where, I mean, you can just look at the news and see how difficult it is to have a lesson inside of a school or a page inside of a history book that identifies the most basic and fundamental issues in our history, moments in our history. I mean, you can't talk about slavery. You can't talk about particular figures in history. You can't use certain language to describe certain things that have happened. How do you talk about slavery in a both sides kind of way, the way that Governor DeSantis might want you to in Florida, right? And this is literally what the legislation is asking for, right? It's to be able to talk about these things in ways that don't make one group look bad over another, right? Or make or show the benefits of both and the affordances and the constraints of something, right? And so the language that we use makes it very difficult to have an honest conversation or a legitimate critique of empire. And so part of what we have to do, part of what we always have to do, is offer those intellectual and educational interventions outside of school. You know, as they say, don't let school get in the way of your education. That means that we have to create spaces outside of school. And if your teachers out there, close your door and do what you got to do, you know, to teach people the truth. But when you're not in these schools, that's what bookstores are for. That's what community centers are for. That's what political education is for. And any of us who grew up in movements know that that was a big part of what we did and what we continue to do. And some of it happens online, although online can be a cesspool now, right? But there's places online to do this. There's places in real life to do this. But we have to be educating and helping youth to understand the issues that are at stake. And there's a way when I turn on TikTok or Instagram and I see teenagers talking about issues that I never had the sophistication to talk about back then, I'm encouraged by it. But they're also constantly assaulted by these other narratives. And so we can't leave them to the epistemological streets, right? We gotta step in and be like, yeah, this is right, this is not correct. We have to provide people with data and facts and evidence. And I think that's the work we do. And so as a bookstore owner, and as someone who does community education, that's been critical for me, not just on this issue, but a range of issues, but this is one of the key ones. And so we have to talk about this in that way. And then I did some similar work, sort of helping to support youth in Palestine, and specifically in Jerusalem, in the Old City, in the African Quarter, as they're also constantly under assault, constantly under threat. You know, almost every young man who I worked with in the Afro-Palestinian youth camp 5 years ago has spent time in prison. And none of them are older than 17 at this point, right? I mean, it's a rite of passage. And there's a reason, and they're not exceptions in any way. And so helping us think about how we can organize in a way that creates new outcomes and to allow those outcomes to not be modeled after the values of our oppressors, right? To not think about, to use Adom Katachu's language, to not think about nation building, but to think about world making. How can we build something new that's liberatory and free for everybody?
Thank you. Can everyone give a warm round of applause to this amazing panel and to Kisra? Thank you.
No, I was done.